today we will study Freud. Because what will happen is Freud will come along and he will present a completely different conception of the movement of history and of the individual. He argues that the individual is really just unconscious forces embedded within the brain. Okay? So these three forces are the superego, the ego, and the id. The ego is who we think we are. The superego are these social forces that act upon us. And the id are these hidden sexual urges. And what he will argue is actually these hidden sexual urges are the true foundations of who we are as well as of civilization. And he names two of them. Okay? The first is what is called the Oedipal. The Oedipal complex. And the second is electrocomplex. So remember that Oedipus is a character from Greek mythology, a king who killed his father and married his mother. Electra is also a character from Greek mythology, a woman who wanted to kill her mother and marry his father. Okay? Electra is from the Aeschylus play, the Oresteia. Freud was remarkably well-read in Greek mythology as well as world literature. So he argues these are the two fundamental bases of who we are. If you're a man, you have the Oedipal complex. If you're a woman, you have the Electra complex. Okay? Now, this is all strange because Kant makes sense, Hegel makes sense, Marx makes sense, and they all seem to flow from each other. And then you have Freud. Okay? So the question then is, where did he get this idea? Where's this from? How did he develop this idea? All right? So we'll look at this question in great detail today. All right. So everyone sort of knew that Freud's theory of the unconscious is problematic. And he had a very famous student, his best student, his heir apparent, named Carl Jung. And Carl Jung really saw Freud as a father, and he worshipped Freud. And he wanted to improve on Freud's theory of the unconscious. And over time, what Carl Jung will do is he will systemize this idea. Okay, so for Carl Jung, we have the ego. And the ego is made up of two forces, the conscious force and the subconscious. The subconscious is also divided into the personal as well as the collective. Sorry, it's not subconscious, it's unconscious, okay? Unconscious. So the personal and conscious are just our memories, our experiences. The collective unconscious is the collection of all society's memories and experiences. And they are captured and expressed whenever we engage in society. When we eat the food, when we talk to people, when we watch movies, when we read books. Okay? The collective unconscious is embedded through society. You breathe it like you would breathe air. Okay? So, Jung also says that we have the animus and the anima. In other words, we are made up of two opposing forces, the male and the female. There's a duality to us. When we meet people, the ego projects a persona. Okay? The persona is just basically our best self in a certain social context. So in school, you're a student, and you try to be the best student. At home, you're a daughter. At McDonald's, you're a friend. Okay, so you are different personas in different social contexts. Now, we try to project our best self, but we are made up of a lot of bad memories, bad thoughts. So the ego suppresses the worst aspects of us in a shadow form, okay? So the shadow is really the alter ego of the ego. And this, Jung argues, is what is called the self. All right? And what he tells us is life is a constant process of self-discovery. If you truly want to master yourself, you must discover who you are, and that will take a lifetime of self-exploration guided by a psychotherapist. All right, and this sounds much more logical, right? And it's become really the standard model for modern-day psychology. Now, you would think that Freud would be happy that Carl Jung came up with this new idea on how to improve his theory. But Freud was infuriated that Jung would question his theory. In fact, Freud was notorious for being a control freak. He excommunicated Jung, refused to have anything to do with him. In fact, everyone in the community around Freud would now distance themselves from Carl Jung, and there would be no reconciliation between the two ever. And that's why Carl Jung had to go and develop this theory. Okay, so and it's strange because all Carl Jung is trying to do is improve Freud. So that gives us a second question: why was Freud so afraid of criticism? Why was he so secretive? All right. And then the third question that we will look at today is, why did this idea become so popular? In fact, the ideas of Freud and Carl Jung will become the basis of a major cultural movement called modernism. And modernism is the cultural movement that we still live in today. Now, there are many different definitions of modernism, but for us, the easiest definition is cult of the self. We live in a world, in a society, in a culture that's obsessed with ourselves, with self-improvement, with self-empowerment. All right? So we will look at where this came from, okay? So the three questions we're looking at today is, first of all, where did Freud get this idea for the Oedipal complex? Second is, why was Freud so secretive? And the third question is, what explains Freud's popularity? Why was he so influential? And why was his influence able to spread so quickly? And what I will show you today is Freud became so influential and so famous not because his psychoanalyst system was designed to help his patients. Ultimately, his system was designed to protect the interests of powerful men. Okay, that's my argument to you today. Okay, so having made the general argument, what I want to do now is look at the evidence to support the argument. Okay, so again, this is a chart that summarizes the different perspectives of these four major thinkers: Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Freud. Okay, so to summarize the main ideas, Freud believes that our sexual urges is what underpins our identity as well as civilization. It's because we cannot control our sexual urges that gives rise to religion, which helps us cope with our guilt. Okay? He also believes that truth lies in our suppressed memories. And in his framework, God has abandoned us. There's really no God in his system. We are left to fend for ourselves. We are left to deal with the trauma of being alone. All right, so let's put Freud in his historical context. So Freud lived and worked at the end of the 19th century, primarily in Vienna. And at this time, Europe was going through fundamental social, cultural, economic, political change. We were transitioning from the pre-modern era to the modern era. Before, we lived primarily in towns and villages where we dealt with each other emotionally. And we had a purpose in our community. But when we moved to the cities, it is money and the clock that regulates our life. And it's still true today, right? So when you come to school, what controls your behavior? It's your grades as well as the clock, right? If you are late for class, if you're absent, then your grades get deducted. Right? So it's the same concept as we have today. All right. Now, because of these social changes, two new fields, sociology and psychology, are developed in order to try to understand what these changes mean for us as humans. So in the field of sociology, there are three major thinkers, pioneers of this time: Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and this man, George Simmel. And George Simmel wrote a wonderful essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life, in which he describes what the impact of moving to the city has on people. Okay, so we'll just read a couple sentences. Instead of reacting emotionally, the metropolitan type reacts primarily in a rational manner, thus creating a mental predominance through the intensification of consciousness, which in turn is caused by it. Thus, the reaction of the metropolitan person to those events is moved to a sphere of mental activity which is least sensitive and which is furthest removed from the depths of the personality. Okay, so let's use a metaphor. Let's think of food. When you're in the village, you grow your own food, and then you make the food, you eat it, and that's it. Okay, you know exactly where the food comes from, you know how it's made, and you're not really curious about the food. But the wonderful thing about the city is you get exposed to all different types of cuisine, all different types of flavors, and that excites your imagination. You're much more curious about it, right? You want to know where this food is made. The problem, though, of course, is this is all an abstraction. You have absolutely no idea where the food comes from. You have absolutely no idea where the food is made. And quite honestly, you don't even know if the food is healthy for you or not. Okay, so the city life is a higher abstraction. And of course, today we have the internet, which is even a higher abstraction, okay? So you go from the village to the city, now to the internet. Of course, this creates a lot of problems for people because this transition causes psychological issues. And the three major psychological issues are enemy, okay? And what this means is, before in the village, you know exactly what to do. But you move to the city, there are different rules, and it confuses you. For example, in the village, if someone punches you, you punch back. And then afterwards, you become friends. In the city, if someone punches you and you punch back, you both go to jail. So it's confusing for people. Okay? Alienation means that you have absolutely no freedom in the city. You work from 9 to 5. You get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, get on at 7 o'clock, then get to work at 9 o'clock. Then you get off at work at 5 and get home at 10 o'clock, okay? So every day is the same regulated life. And you lack freedom, okay? And that causes alienation. The last idea is disenchantment, where you feel as though you are just a machine and you have lost human agency. Okay, so this creates lots of psychological issues. And that's why at this time, psychology is becoming much more popular. This is Sigmund Freud, and he was a very ambitious medical student who became a psychologist. And he started to see patients. And these patients were often young women who are historical. Historical is not a word we use anymore, but back then it just meant that they couldn't control their emotions. They were prone to outbursts, crying. When they saw a man, when they were touched by a man, they screamed, they cried. They couldn't form healthy relationships. Okay? And so Freud was tasked with figuring out why this was happening and trying to help these women. And he spent a lot of time with these women, And he did something pretty novel at the time, which is he just won their trust and asked them directly, why are you like this? And the woman, after many sessions, after becoming friends with Freud, they start to confide in Freud, and they told him the truth, which is, I'm hysterical, I'm afraid of men touching me because when I was young, my father abused me. And Freud, at first, was shocked. I think everyone would be shocked. But over time, he would hear this story from so many different patients with the same symptoms that he concluded that they must be telling him the truth. And he wrote a very famous paper in 1896 called The Etiology of Hysteria. Etiology means origins, okay? And in it he says, my previously communicated assumption that trauma, specifically sexual trauma, cannot be stressed enough as a pathogenic agent was confirmed anew. Even children of respected, high-minded, parental families fall victim to real rape much more frequently than one had dared to suspect. Either the parents themselves seek substitution for their lack of satisfaction in this pathological manner, or else trusted persons such as relatives abuse the ignorance and innocence of children. Okay? So he's arguing that abuse is much more common than we are led to believe. Even those that we think are pillars of society engage in this sort of abuse. So what he's doing is that he's becoming an advocate for these women. He's telling the world they're not crazy, they're not being hysterical, they were traumatized, and that's why they're behaving like this. If you got hit by a car, your leg wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to walk. Well, these women are the same way. They were traumatized physically when they were young, and that's why they are behaving like this. That's why they have problems forming these emotional bonds with others. The symptoms of hysteria are determined by certain experiences of the patients which have operated in a traumatic fashion and which are being reproduced in his psychological life in the form of mnemic symbols, okay? So what he's saying is, this is not made up in the mind. This happened physically, and then it gets represented in the mind. So that's Freud arguing for his patients. Now, let me introduce you to a man named Jeffrey Masson. And he wrote a book called The Assault on Truth. His story is this. He went to Harvard, and he became very interested in psychoanalysis. And he began to study it. And he became friends with Anna Freud, who is Sigmund Freud's daughter. Anna Freud thought very highly of him. And she trusted him with the letters of Sigmund Freud. And before, this was not open to the public, and no one knew about these letters. But Jeffrey Masson spent years going over the letters. And what he discovered shocked him. The early Freud and the later Freud are two different people. They have two different theories about trauma and abuse. Okay? And in his book, he presents the evidence, which are Freud's letters to friends. All right, so let's just read a couple. This is early Freud. I therefore put forward the thesis that at the bottom of every case of hysteria, there are one or more occurrences of premature experience, occurrences which belong to the earliest years of childhood. Okay? There are a whole number of other things that vouch for the reality of infantile sexual scenes. In the first place, there's the uniformity which they exhibit in certain details. So what he's saying is, I know that people don't believe me, but the evidence is clear. I've talked to different people. They don't know each other. And they're telling the same story. They're providing the same details. So either there's this giant conspiracy, or they're telling the truth. It is less easy to refute the idea that the doctor forces reminiscences of this sort on the patient, that he influences him by suggesting to imagine and reproduce them. Nevertheless, it appears to me equally untenable. I've never yet succeeded in forcing on a patient a scene I was expecting to find in such a way that he seemed to be living through it with all the appropriate feelings. Perhaps others may be more successful in this. When you read Freud, you see him as a very clear, as a very nuanced, as a very balanced thinker. Okay? He accepts there are different possibilities. It's possible that he himself is suggesting false memories to his patients. And he says, this is possible, but I have failed to achieve this goal. And there are others who may be better at this than I, but I haven't been able to do it, okay? So based on this evidence, he argues that these patients must be telling the truth. Okay? This is the early Freud. This is Sandor Ferenczi, and for the longest time, they were colleagues. They were best friends. They were both advocates for patients. And then they had a falling out, okay? They started to, they basically refused to talk to each other anymore, okay? And the reason why is Sandor Ferenczi continued to advocate for patient rights, whereas Sigmund Freud completely changed his attitude. All right, so let's look at the new Freud. Since child masturbation is such a general occurrence and is at the same time so poorly remembered, it must have an equivalent in psychic life. And in fact, it is found in the fantasy encountered in most female patients, namely that the father seduced her in childhood. This is a later reworking which is designed to cover up the recollection of infantile sexual activity and represents an excuse and extenuation thereof. The grain of truth contained in this fantasy lies in the fact that the father, by way of his innocent caresses in earliest childhood, has actually awakened the little girl's sexuality. It is these same affectionate fathers that are the ones who then endeavor to break the child of the habit of masturbation. Okay, so what Freud is trying to say is young girls from a very early age, they are sexual animals. They have these urges, and they have this longing for the father. And it's compounded by the fact that the father, in his innocence, hugs and caresses his little girl. It's made worse when the father notices that the girl is masturbating and tries to stop her. And this creates a sense of both resentment, hatred, and more longing. Okay? So now what Freud is saying is, it's not the father. The father did nothing. He's innocent. The girl is the one who because of these sexual urges, has all these sexual fantasies that she is no longer able to differentiate between fantasy and reality. All right? So this is from the essay, Fragments of Analysis of Hysteria. The love-hungry little girl, unhappy at having to share her parents' affection with her brothers and sisters, realizes that all that tenderness comes flowing back when her parents are made anxious by her illness. The girl now knows a way of calling forth her parents' love. So now he's explaining why hysteria is so common in society. And the answer is very simple. Women are desperate for attention. It's that simple. They're fine, they have no issues, they just want attention. And that's why they are hysterical, okay? Because they know that illness attracts attention from caregiving males. This is Sigmund Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents. And in it, he expresses his contempt for women in society. All right, let's read it. Furthermore, women should soon come into opposition to civilization and display their retarding and restraining influence. Those very women who, in the beginning, laid the foundations of civilization for the claims of their love. Women represent the interests of the family and of sexual life. The work of civilization has become increasingly the business of men. It confronts them with ever more difficult tasks and compels them to carry out instinctual sublimations of which women are little capable. All right, so Freud's saying this. We must thank women because without women, there'd be no civilization. They give birth, they raise families. But men are smarter than women. And so men are tasked with the responsibility of building civilization, of creating science, of creating literature, of creating philosophy, of politics, of administration. Okay? But what all women want is attention, to be doted on. And that's why women hate civilization. First of all, because they're not smart and they can't really contribute to civilization, but also because it takes men away from them. Okay? So now the question then is, okay, this is like really strange because The Freud that we encountered earlier was a scientist. Very clear, very nuanced, very subtle in his thinking. This Freud, he's like a myth maker. He's almost like a priest. Okay, so what explains this transition? Okay, well, there's a very simple explanation, right? The simple explanation, which is simple explanation, is he may be treating his patients who are young women, but who's paying the bills? The father, right? It's the father who's paying Freud. So if Freud went to the father and said, oh, I talked to your daughter, it's your fault that she's like this, well, they wouldn't be very happy. Okay? So we can understand why, at the end of the day, Freud decided that he needed to change his story if he wanted to maintain his clientele. So the question then is, okay, is there evidence to suggest that sexual trauma and abuse was common in Vienna at this time in history, the late 19th century? And the answer is yes. There is some piece of evidence, okay, not complete, okay, but there's some piece of evidence to suggest this was actually a thing in Vienna in the late 19th century. So Vienna is part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, and there are lots of secret societies and religious cults at this time. Okay, one of them is called Frankinism, and Frankinism rejected Jewish norms, and believed they were obligated to transgress moral boundaries. Okay, remember the question of faith, right? How do you demonstrate your faith in God? How do you know God loves you? How do you know you're faithful? Well, you break taboos. And they were breaking a lot of taboos. The Frankists engaged in sexually promiscuous rites, such as the infamous 1756 incident where they were allegedly caught dancing around a half-naked woman. At its height, Frankinism claimed perhaps 50,000 followers. That's a lot. 50,000 followers is a lot. And a lot of them were powerful people. Primarily Jews living in the Polish Lutheran Commonwealth, as well as Central and Eastern Europe. Later, Frankists were encouraged to convert in mass to Catholicism, okay? And so who are these people? Well, they are followers of a man named Sabbatai Zevi, who lived in 19th century, who was a Jewish rabbi who lived in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. And for many, he was extremely charismatic, and he was basically their Messiah. Okay? He was the Jewish Messiah. And he preached a religion of transgression because transgression meant courage. It meant empowerment. It meant true faith. And he had a lot of followers. And that's why the Sultan called him in and said, okay, I'll give you a choice. You can either continue doing what you do, and I'll kill you, or you convert to Islam. So he converted to Islam. But when he did so, he told his followers, I did so because God doesn't care about what you do. God cares about what's in your heart. As long as you're true to God, what you do in life does not matter. Okay? And the religion he started is still around today. Okay? And this is from Wikipedia, okay? All this is from Wikipedia, and you can look at it online to make sure that I'm just making this up, all right? So as part of this movement, I mean, you can read this, right? All right? Sexual abuse was actually pretty common. So we have evidence to suggest that, yes, these women were probably telling the truth, and Freud knew so. But Freud ultimately had to change his story in order to protect his livelihood. Okay, but there's also another reason why Freud had to change his story. Okay, and it has to do with a man named Ignaz Semmelweis. Ignaz Semmelweis lived in 1840s Vienna. And he was a doctor who worked at Vienna General Hospital. And he was in charge of 2 maternity clinics, places where women gave birth. Same hospital, same staff, but the mortality rate at the second clinic was much higher than the first clinic. Women could die giving birth because of fever. So 10% of women were dying in the second clinic, and only about 3% were dying in the first clinic. So in the Semmelweis, he was appalled by this. And so he launched an investigation as to what was happening. And he spent 7 months, a long, long time, trying to figure out what was happening. And he looked at all different possibilities, including weather, including treatment, including personnel, everything, okay? And then he had a radical breakthrough. He had an insight, which is this. In the second clinic, it was a teaching hospital. So doctors would in the morning work with cadavers, okay? They would show students how to dissect cadavers. And then in the afternoon, they'd go and deliver babies. And Semmelweis, he didn't know why, because at this time, germs were not a thing. People didn't know about the existence of germs. He didn't know why, but he theorized that there could be a connection. So he created a protocol. He basically had everyone wash their hands using a formula of water, chlorine, and lime. And we still use it today, exactly the same formula today. And so he tried this protocol, and it was a miracle because after people started to wash their hands, no one died in childbirth anymore. And Semmelweis, being a rigorous scientist, he collected all this data, conducted a lot of experiments to prove this had to be true, that washing your hands could save lives. And then he presented his findings to the staff, the doctors of Vienna General Hospital, believing that they would praise him and then promote this all throughout Europe in order to save as many lives as possible. Instead, the doctors told him they had to keep this quiet. They'll promote Semmelweis, they respect him, and he did amazing work, but if word came out that this was true, then people would know that they were responsible for the deaths of these women before, and their reputation would be in tatters. And then Semmelweis, of course, responded by, yes, I understand that, but if we don't publish our findings, if we don't let the world know about this, more women are going to die in childbirth. And they fought for a long time, years and years. And then eventually, Semmelweis, he was blacklisted. He was not allowed to work ever in a hospital again. And then ultimately, he was confined to an insane asylum where he was killed by the guards. And he died, leaving a young family. And so that's what happens to you when you defy powerful people in Vienna in the 19th century. And Freud didn't want the same fate. Okay? And he also had a young family. So this story is horrible, but if you don't believe me, you can go on Wikipedia, okay? He was institutionalized in an insane asylum by his colleagues, and in the asylum, he was beaten by the guards. He died 14 days later, all right? So this is the fate that will happen to you in Vienna if you defy powerful people. So now we have an explanation for why Freud made the transition, why he changed his story. But now there's another problem, which is, how does Freud convince his patients to go along, right? Before he told his patients, I believe you, and they trusted him, and now he's changing his story. So how can he convince them that they, in fact, do suffer from sexual fantasies? And like this experience of sexual abuse, it's all just made up in the head. Okay, that's a very hard job to do. So the solution is the interpretation of dreams. All right? So Freud pioneered a new way of hypnotizing his patients. So together they would analyze their dreams, right? Because if you talk about their memories in their past, they're going to fight back and says, I remember very clearly. If you talk about their dreams, that allows you to suggest subtly new ideas and new memories, to basically implant new memories and basically gaslight that person. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so the interpretation of dreams. So that is the story of Freud. Okay? But this leaves a question is, why did this spread throughout the world? All right? And that's something that we will look at in part 3. So a lot of the influence of Freud has to do with Carl Jung, who will take his ideas of the unconscious and systemize it for popular consumption. Okay? So we already discussed his framework where we are all dualities, okay? We have an ego, but we also have a shadow. We have a conscious, but also a unconscious, a personal as well as collective, an animus and an anima. Jung popularized ideas of personality types, right? Introvert, extrovert, which is what we still use today,